Everyone wants peace, but no one actually trusts each other enough to risk it. So how is society actually bound together? Well, this philosopher had a very dark answer. In his book, The Problem of Political Authority, Michael Huemer asks us to imagine this scenario. He says that, imagine we live in a small village with a significant crime problem. In order to solve this problem, you decide one day on a whim that you're going to go out, buy a few guns, round up some vandals in your town and put them in your basement or lock them in there. The next week you gather up all of your neighbours and you demand from them $100 towards your crime prevention fund without ever informing them that you were actually going to be doing this. And they all rightly are pretty outraged. They go, hell no, no way. But in response you say that if you don't pay this, you're going to brandish him a criminal also, kidnap him and put him in your basement too.
Yeah. I'm the man.
This sounds pretty absurd, but in Huemer's view this is basically a rudimentary form of government. And you might be saying no modern government would ever act like this. But when you think about it, this is almost precisely what happens. So the question becomes, what gives a government the right to enforce their rules or enforce their laws when single individuals don't have this right? So today we're going to have a little chat about a philosopher called Thomas Hobbes and his text Leviathan. Hobbes was possibly the most influential political philosopher of all time, and the Leviathan underpins basically everything we think about political philosophy today. It was published during the course of the English Civil War in 1651, which led him to a fascination with the question of how to keep order within society when his society was so disorderly. It was this very question of what gives the government the right to use violence when individual people don't have this right. And he thought that there was a real qualitative difference between individual people and a sovereign, as he called it, or a government or a state in modern language. And to understand why he thought this, we need to take a little dive into his theory of society, human nature, and morals. So over the course of the Leviathan, Hobbes established one very central concern of the entire thing, that why would we ever agree to anyone else's rules or their decrees by anything but necessity? So where does this necessity come from, and what are the things that motivate people to act in the first place? For Hobbes, the very first thing was the fact that we seek certain desires, but we also have a very limited amount of material things to satisfy these things. If you remember back to our last video about Austrian economics, this was a term called scarcity. And through a modern lens, this is basically the building blocks of Hobbes' approach. Unlike the economists, however, Hobbes thought that when you have a society full of people who really want lots of stuff, but there's only so much stuff you can give, then it becomes a state not of peaceful exchange, but it becomes a state of conflict. Sometimes living peacefully is a matter of disposition, only applies to very certain people who actually want to be peaceful in the first place. Perhaps if you live in a culture that's not super peaceful, then you won't be so inclined to act peacefully. Instead, people can just cut out the hard part and they can go straight to violence. If you're really desperate for a coconut, then you might not want to go out and get the thing that the people want in order to exchange for a coconut. You might just hit them in the face instead and take their coconut from them.
Are you suggesting coconuts migrate? Not at all. They could be carried. What?
Yet there's a really important concept here, something that you must first possess in order to obtain the stuff that you want through something other than peaceful exchange. And what is this thing?
Power!
If you don't have the physical might in the first place to back up any of your threats that you make, then you're nothing but an empty vessel. And what's worse, the more you're known for making empty threats, the less and less valuable they become. No one acts upon them because they don't believe it to be true. So Hobbes called this process of constantly moving desire one object onto another a term called felicity. He compared it to material principles of motion, where he thought that if an object was still, it would be still eternally, but if an object was in motion, then it would always be in motion until something else stilled it. And he thought that human desire was much the same. It eternally moved until something else stopped it. To put it more formally, felicity is the continual progression of desire from one object to another. So if we bring it back to the very basics of society, the thing is that most of us, biologically speaking, are fairly equal. Even if someone has more might than another, it can always be cancelled out with charisma, with networking, with whatever else. And inevitably from this view, we get a pretty pessimistic view of human nature, where everyone has to look out for themselves, form groups to protect themselves, or form power alliances in order to obtain these different kinds of objects of their desire. And these desires, of course, according to felicity, are never ending. They just move from one object to another even when they are satisfied. And for Hobbes, this can only lead to one outcome. Instead, fear and violence no longer become a worry, but become a constant reality. So you may be thinking up to this point that everything I've said in this video rests on a very poor conception of human nature, that humans are these power maximizing machines that do everything in order to obtain their own desires. And obviously we know from experience that this isn't really true. But Hobbes also knew this, and he still came to the same conclusion. So the question is, why? And the answer is that Hobbes didn't view this violence or fear as a symptom of character defect. He viewed it as something more structural, something inherent within this kind of society without a central enforcer of power. And as we referred to earlier in political philosophy, this is generally called the state of nature. So to formally define this state of affairs, the state of nature is characterized as a pre-political society where there is no common authority to enforce laws. This state of nature in particular is very important for Hobbes, because if you recall our question at the start of this video as to why governments have the right to use force but individuals don't, his answer can basically be found in this state of affairs. In addition to our earlier comments about the restless movement of human desire, there's also the need for power over society. So in Hobbes' Leviathan, how do you establish power? Well, in the absence of a government, people can use their physical might or their resources in a few different ways. The three of the most easily identifiable are for gain, for safety, and for the glory of reputation. The important conclusion here is that even in a civilized society, even if every single person were very altruistic, if they didn't trust each other enough to not commit violence or use their physical might to obtain stuff, then they would always be on their toes looking out for other people. So the state of constant violence comes about by one particular thing, which is fear. To put this in a more modern perspective, let's just think of the fact that even in small, safe villages with fully established legal codes, they have CCTV cameras, they have police officers on call, we have all of these modern inventions which keep us safe, and yet we still don't trust each other enough to not lock our doors at night, or we look at each other suspiciously on the street when we're behaving odd. Now imagine that we didn't have all of these institutions or technologies, and now think, how much more suspicious would we be of each other? Would we ever trust each other? And this is the kind of hypothetical that Hobbes was thinking through when he talked of the state of nature. And he was talking in 1651, so it was a lot less safe then than it is now. Even for individuals who want to just protect themselves and protect their assets, they might find it beneficial to attack others in order to establish reputation as this big top dog in society, so that other people don't come attacking them. And another philosopher called Jonathan Wolfe really helps elaborate this in his text, An Introduction to Political Philosophy. So he writes that, as in the school playground, those with a reputation for winning fights are least likely to be attacked for their goods, and may even have goods surrendered to them by others who feel unable to defend themselves. While those with a reputation for strength cannot relax either, they are the most likely victims of those seeking to enhance their reputation. But still, this kind of hypothetical can be very tough to properly imagine given that we live in a completely different landscape in modern society. Or do we? Let's just take an example from our modern day, which is the world that exists in between nations. So if you think about it, while there's a body that enforces laws and has this kind of political authority over us within our borders or domestically, in the sense of having a government, internationally, these bodies are not the same at all. While we do have bodies such as the UN Commission, they don't really have that much power over the governments themselves. There is no true government who manages the government, and even if there was, our question would simply just become, who manages the government that manages the government that manages the government?
What are you talking about?
And at this stage in geopolitics, it's probably fair to say that a lot of it works basically the same as Hobbes' state of nature. It works on fear and the power of reputation. So if everyone in this horrible barbaric society is forced to commit violence and engage in a structural state of fear, where are the place for morals in any of this? Is nobody moral in Hobbes' society? Well, kind of.
Fucking brawl, come down to Nevic Hospitality, I'll come out of my house and I'll break your fucking legs.
Hobbes introduces quite an important distinction within his political philosophy that's often overlooked, and that he does actually have laws of nature that are derived from reason. Or in other words, even in the state of nature, there exists a moral code. Hobbes actually states what he thinks these were, and they were generally divided into three kind of points and one overarching principle. For these 3 points, we have first, that each individual ought to seek peace and follow it. Second, when others are willing, men must lay down their right to all things for the sake of peace. Third, all individuals ought to perform their promises as made in agreements with each other. The guiding principle was essentially an inversion of the Christian doctrine, and Hobbes stated it like follows. do not that to another which thou wouldest not have done to thyself. Or in modern English, don't do to someone else what you wouldn't do to yourself also. Now, if you're very carefully paying attention here, you might have noticed in the second clause there's a very important stipulation which states when others are willing. And why is this? Basically because Hobbes thought that the laws of nature followed from one basic principle, which was that of self-preservation. That comes above all. If you follow these very peaceful and pacifistic laws when others don't, your chances of self-preservation are quite low. Even still, this can be a little abstract, so let's look at it through the lens of a story. Imagine you're living in this state of nature and you're a scrawny guy like me who's working as, say, a baker. One day when you're mulling over these natural laws as you would have it, say they're set on some stone commandment, some big buff, whatever a gym bro was before feudal times, comes into the shop and demands some of your pastries. And you've heard about these guys before, so you've made sure to hire all of your colleagues to also be big buff gym men, so there's just a bakery of one scrawny guy and a huge muscular dudes. In this situation, you might be the most peace-loving, pacifistic hippie on earth.
Well, that's just groovy, baby.
But what are you meant to do? This guy's trying to steal from your shop. Even if this big buff guy never entered the shop, the point is in the first place you still hired all of this protection as insurance because of the fear that exists in this kind of society. If you don't trust anyone else enough to also seek peace, then it's for nothing. There are no laws to follow if you cannot also preserve yourself. So what then needs to be done to secure peace? We have to follow peace, it's in the natural commandments, and then how do we get there? The primary answer now found in political philosophy following Hobbes is that there needs to be some kind of body which exercises this monopoly on force. Each individual possesses this natural right, but when they establish a sovereign or when they establish a government, they give up this liberty to that in order to punish. Thus, the answer to our question of why a government is different to individual citizens is that the difference between a single individual and a government is that governments use legitimate force, and it is legitimate as without a government there would be no way to ensure peace in the state of nature. Or, at his most elegant, Hobbes wrote that covenants without the sword are but words of no strength to secure a man at all. Therefore, notwithstanding the laws of nature, which everyone hath then kept, when he has the will to keep them, and when he can do it safely, if there be no power erected, or not great enough for security, every man will and may lawfully rely on his strength and art of caution against all other men. This has been a pretty systematic presentation, so let's try compress the argument into syllogism form. If you don't know what a syllogism is, it just works on premises and conclusions that build up to the conclusion. In our case here, we have Premise 1. Every rational individual desires peace and ought to follow the laws of nature when it aligns with his self-preservation. Premise 2. The state of nature is permeated by constant fear and uncertainty about whether others will follow the laws of nature. Premise 3. By instituting a body of legitimate force which can enforce the moral laws, individuals ensure others' commitments to the laws of nature, which they all ought to follow, thereby obtaining peace. And our conclusion is that every rational individual would agree to forfeit their own liberty to establish a sovereign or a government who may enforce laws and ensure peace. So all in all, we've seen that humans are basically infinite desire machines. They have limited amounts of material objects to satisfy an infinite amount of wants. To obtain these things, they must possess power and employ felicity. Even if these people are altruistic and good-natured, the state of fear makes it impossible for these people to follow their peace-loving ways. They only apply when you can comfortably preserve yourself in the first place to follow these laws. All other people must also be seeking peace. In order to follow these laws, we need someone to actually enforce them, and for Hobbes, this answer was the government. So I hope you enjoyed the video. This was our first entry on a political philosophy type video, so let me know if you enjoyed it. And if you're already familiar with Hobbes' work, you might already notice that I've left a pretty glaring gap about Hobbes' view, which is his argument for absolute sovereignty. For those not familiar, basically Hobbes took this conclusion about government to its absolute extreme and believed that we should never disobey them. If you're interested in this, I'll leave you with two options. First, this piece was actually adapted by something I published on Substack early this year, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. If you're really interested, then you can read that now. Or if you prefer video form, then let me know in the comments below if you want a second part to this video based on that argument, because it proved very controversial among political philosophers. So please drop a like and consider subscribing to the channel. We're still new here and about 94% of people who watch my videos still haven't subscribed, so it would be a great help. Bye bye!